Hi and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting the new Commissar Yarrick from the Astra Militarum faction for Warhammer 40k. Pretty much following the box art, just added a little flame bit on the front of the base just to add a little bit of just something a bit different on the model. That bit is from Epic Basing and you can buy them either as STLs or the actual resin bit. So it's two sub-assemblies. It's the base on one part and Commissar Yarrick on the other. The only reason I did that was because I've got the flame bit and we're going to do a little bit of airbrushing a bit later. So what we've done is I started off by basing the model in AK Tenebrous Grey. You could just use a normal matte black. I just prefer Tenebrous Grey, it just gives a little bit of difference to some of the sort of base tones that we're going to be using. And just to pick out some of the details at first, just so they stand out a little bit on the camera, and just so they obviously, because some of these models they're really heavily detailed, and sometimes those details can be lost. And I just prefer on some of these smaller models just to give the model a little dry brush, nothing too fierce, just to pick out some of those initial details that we want to cover. It's also there's a lot of red on this model, and red can be quite tough to paint, so using this dry brushing effect you can pick out those red areas a little bit more heavily so that the red can actually have a decent base coat and shine a little bit more. So for this I'm just using AK Light Earth, but you can use any pale colour to do this dry brush, or you could start off from a pale colour itself like Xandri Dust or something, just base coat the model in any sort of light colour. I always start dark and go to light just because it helps give those initial shadows that we're going for, so you don't have to do any washes. So we do a little bit of washing in this with some Nuln Oil a bit later on, but this step is optional, but I just find it helps pick out some of those little details and you don't lose them. The dry brushes I'm using are from Artify. Okay, we're actually going to start with red. There's quite a bit of it on there, so I wanted to start with one of the primary colours. So the first colour we're using is AK Black Red. It's a nice dark red, pretty good coat coverage you can get on this, and it's really just a simple case of just picking out any of the red. So it's on his massive claw hand, his belt, a little bit around his neck area, a bit on his cap, and on his backpack. I'm using a size 1 brush from the Raphael 8404 series. You can use a size 0 if you want to go a little bit smaller. And as if by magic, we're just going to skip forward a little bit and I'll show you all of the red that's been painted. Don't worry about going over any of the areas, we can tidy those up a little bit later. Now, to get the bright red, I'm using from Ionic Red. They're really good colours, really heavy pigmented colours, pretty good coverage. But what I've done is, on the wet palette that I'm using, I've done a couple of drops of the paint and added a drop of water just to thin it down a little bit. And what I'm doing here is I'm adding an extra layer to get that brightness, but I'm doing it in a scratchy sort of motion. It's not just a sort of a flat layering. I'm doing it in a scratchy, dotty, haphazardy way because I want to show a little bit of wear and tear on the claw, like it's not brand new. So little lines following in almost the direction you want the light to be. So moving the brush from the darkest areas into the lightest areas helps get that, because the most paint is left where you move the brush away from. So as you're moving the paint away from an area, more paint is left when the brush leaves. So if you just bear that in mind, you can see where I'm moving the paint left and right and towards the model, away from the model, is just moving it away from those shadow areas. And I just work around all the red areas with this principle in mind, doing the edge highlights as normal and adding as many layers as you want to intensify the brightness. If you wanted to go really bright, you could do some thin lines of white and then go over it with this red and you'd get a really intense red. But I wanted to go for a more wear and tear on Yarrick. Even though it's a new model, he's still a bit of an ancient old guy with a nice orcish type claw on his arm, and I wanted to reflect that in the painting of it. And then you just work around on the backpack, on his gloves, the tabard. I just do normal highlighting on the tabard, just a few little edge highlights because it is quite small, and then on his backpack as well. For the edge highlighting, we're going to be using from Vallejo model colour, which is brown rose. You could use the Warhammer Cadian Fleshtone, but any sort of brightish fleshish pink colour is good to highlighting red, especially in metallics. It gives a nice bright finish. I add a little bit of water to this just to thin it down, not too much, probably a 70-30, so a couple of drops of paint, one little drop of water on the brush, just to thin it down a little bit, and to pick out the edges just where I wanted to be the bright spots, and then add some little thin scratches here and there, pick out the little rivets that you can see, and then just apply that principle across all of the red areas. Just take your time. As you can see, I've not got much paint on the brush. I angle the model all over the place just so I can get the brush angle where I need it to be, and just scrape it along each of the edges, and then add a few little marks here and there just to show some wear and tear. And with that, the red is done. It's already starting to stand out. Now we're going to do some non-metallic metal, some silver. And I wanted this to look a little bit cartoony, not just overly realistic. And so for this, we're just going to be using two colours for this non-metallic metal. So that's AK dark sea blue and AK white. That's it, just two colours. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to base coat all of the metals I want in the dark sea blue. So that's this little bit that connects it to his arm, the actual claw, the connector parts, anywhere what you want to be metal, just base coat in the dark sea blue. And then all the principles is the lighter that we want the area to be, we add more white. So wherever you want the the sun to be, all the light to be reflecting off of it, we will go brighter and brighter and brighter, which means adding more white to the dark sea blue. So at first off it starts maybe an 80-20 mix, and then a 70-30, 50-50, then you flip it so there's more white than blue, and you just get progressively smaller with your highlights the brighter you go, always remembering at some point you do need to edge highlight. I don't edge highlight with the brightest white. I usually edge highlight with the one that's about 70-30 in favour of your bright colour to dark colour, to do an all over edge highlight. That's one with non-metallic metals. It's one key thing to have, is edge highlighting with a brightish colour, just to give some definition to the shape. If you don't want to do this in non-metallic metal, obviously just paint it with your normal metallic colours like a lead boucher or a gunmetal, any of your dark metallic colours, and then just highlight them with a brighter one, even doing a wash. This is quite a long part of the video here, because there is quite a lot of metals around Yarrick, but just follow the shapes where you want your sunlight to be. Always make your highlights smaller and smaller the further you go. He's got his breastplate, which is also silver, so that's just done with little lines, picking out the details, leaving the darkest areas in the shadow, trying to think where the sunlight is coming from. So for my Yarrick, the sunlight is coming over from his left shoulder downwards, so anything there, anything pointing upwards would be quite bright. Remembering, I'm not wanting to go too bright here because we do have his flame effect at the bottom, but if you don't have anything like that, then you can push your highlights as much as you want. Just remember, you must have darks to have highlights, and you must have a nice highlight to show the dark. Without dark you can't have light, and without light you can't have dark. But just keep your highlights minimal. Don't have too many, otherwise it's all in highlight and it doesn't really work. And try and keep your highlights really next to dark areas as well, because that helps sell the contrast which non-metallic metal goes for. It's that contrast between light and dark. In some of these areas I'm almost dry brushing the paint over it to get edge highlights. Practice, this is a good model to practice on because there's lots of shapes, lots of defined edges that you can pick out. So have fun with it. And I said this is only using two colours, so the dark sea blue and white, and we're just mixing and mixing, adding a little bit of water to each mix so that the paint flows well off of the brush. You can see at this point we started to get some nice definition now, and we're probably at about a 50-50 mix. So there's a lot of white. This is where we start flipping it now, where there's more white in the mix. So our highlights will now get smaller and smaller and smaller. As you can see, we're almost at the final stages now. We're not at pure white, but it's almost looking like it's pure white against the dark that we've had originally. We've got some really nice definitions now of the gun around the pipe work. His breastplate is really starting to stand out. So all of those little details that we had are all being picked out really nicely with this non-metallic metal with just these two colours. Here we're almost at pure white now. This is probably about a 90-10 mix in favour of white. Just a tiny few dots and dashes here and there just to pick out those real bright points of the model. And then I just hit it with some pure white, even smaller highlights now, very, very tiny, just some strategic places where I wanted that brightest point to be. Now we're going to use some good old Nuln Oil, and all I'm doing here, very small amounts on the brush, is that I'm washing this and spreading it into those darkest recesses just to get some definition around, because that's obviously the Aquila that's on his shoulder, on his breastplate. I wanted some definition there, and I'm remembering that rule of where you push the paint, where you leave the brush is where the most paint is going to be left, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm just pushing that paint into those areas. I mean, you could give the entire model a wash of Nuln Oil here if you wanted to, but I was just focusing on those areas just to get some definition and some shapes around some of the rivets around the Aquila, just so that the highlights stand out a bit further. With the non-metallic silver done, we're now going to go on to non-metallic gold, and we're just going to use a few colours here. So the first colour that we are going to use is from Vallejo, the model colour Air, and it is Flat Earth. I'm just grabbing it from my little, because this is the first time I'm using these three colours. They were recommended to me by a friend. So yeah, the first colour we're using is Vallejo Model Air Flat Earth, and this is our darkest colour. So straight from that Tenebrous Grey, we're using this Flat Earth colour, and all I'm doing here is any areas that I want to be gold, which is the trim around his hat, the Aquila on the top of his breastplate, a little bit of edging on his cloak, his coat, a little bit on his gun. It's not too much, and the sword hilt. It's not too much gold on Yarrick. Just base coat in the Vallejo model colour, sorry, Flat Earth. The next colour is the Vallejo model colour Gold Brown. Quite a step up, but these paints are quite thin already, so they're quite translucent. This is where we're going to layer our first highlight. So a bit like the silver, just imagine where you want your highlight to be, and then do dashes and marks and scratches and scrapes where you want, especially on the cloak here, where you want your highlight to be. This is where I pick out all the edges, so I do an edge highlight with this as well, and I just pick out where I imagine the gold to be brighter. So on the tops of his little shoulder pad parts, the top of the sword, I'm layering quite heavily, leaving some of that flat earth in the deepest recesses, but always making sure we're doing an edge highlight around. So for instance, on his sword hilt, it's an edge highlight all around that sword, but it's dark flat earth on the bottom towards the ground, and this gold brown at the top where the highlight will be. Okay, the next colour, and it's quite a jump up here, is the Vallejo model colour Flat Yellow. you can see we're not doing any mixing. I just add a little bit of water into this just to thin it down a little bit. So this is another edge highlight, a little bit thinner edge highlight if you can. And this is where we're picking out where I want the brightest points to be. And this is where we start making it look a little bit like gold. So always add a little bit of highlight next to your darkest shadows and just pick out all your little shapes. Not too much, just filling in a smaller area than you've done before with this colour. So fully covered in flat earth, then about another half of it is covered in gold brown, and then only about 20% of it is covered in the flat yellow to start giving that gold effect and that contrast. Once we're happy with this little highlight, we're then going to move on to the next colour, which will be AK Ice Yellow. This is a really heavily desaturated yellow, almost white, and this is a very, very small highlight now. As you can see here, but as you can see, it's already bright on the just on the camera. And this is a very small edge highlight, and just little lines of this where you want your bright points to be. Right next to some of those dark areas as well, just to sell the shadows and the contrast. But yeah, just a few little dots of this where you want your bright points to be, and then I'm just going to hit it with a little bit of white, again only on those brightest points, the white, a couple of little dots here and there where that sunlight is piercing it, and there you go, you've got non-metallic gold. We used 5 colours including white, and we've gone from a darkish reddish brown all the way up to a pale yellow, and got a lovely gold effect with no mixing. If you're using this on larger areas, you could start doing blends. So you would do a blend of your darkest to your mid-tone, and then add some of that flat yellow into it, and then add a little bit of ice yellow into it just to get a nice blend. But on these smaller models where there's not so much flat area, or there's just little details to pick up, they're really good and easy to pick out non-metallic metal tricks, because you can get the effect very, very quickly with just a couple of colours. To finish off his hat, he's got a little green aquila, and for that I just use 2 mid green and a light green. I think I use like a forest green and a frog green from AK, but any mid-tone green and then a bright green as a highlight will do for that aquila on his hat. Once I've done it, I just give that hat a wash of Nuln Oil, just pushing some of it into those shadows and recesses just to pick out some of the detail, as some of it was a little bit lost. So I'm just pushing some of that paint into the deepest recesses just to get some contrast and some definition of the shapes. So the next step is for the black of his coat, and what I've done is I used a colour from Ionic called Cold Black. The Warhammer equivalent would be sort of Corvus Black, so it's a very, very dark grey, almost black. And I base coated all of his coat in that, including his shoes, the sleeves, the top of his hat, in this Ionic Cold Black. And then all I did was add a little bit of white to it and made a wash, and then any of these raised areas I just picked out ever so loosely with this sort of cold black and a little bit of white wash, very heavily thinned down, lots of water. At the end of this I do go over it with some AK dark rust just so it blends in with the base. So it's not too much here, just picking out some of these areas with that dark grey wash. If you were using Corvus Black, it's the same principle, so a little bit of Corvus Black, mix in a little bit of white, then add lots of water just to wash it down. It looks really bright on there, but don't forget we're going over black. But because it's a heavy wash, it dries back to almost, you can't even notice it. And then I just do an edge highlight with a little bit of the mix, a bit thicker the mix, not as much water. Just do an edge highlight to pick out any of those raised areas of the cloak coat. We're getting close to finishing the main model, just some bit of leather work to do next. So I'm using I use actually 4 colours for this. So I use AK Leather Brown as the main base coat, then a bit of layering with AK Saddle Brown, then I do edge highlighting with the AK Brown Rose, or you could use Cadian Fleshtone for that, and then using some AK Vamperic Flesh, I do some very small highlights and add some scratches and rips with the leather. Vampiric Flesh would be like Pallid Witch Flesh or Flayed One Flesh from the Warhammer range, and it's just a case of just doing your basic base coating and then layering with the lighter and lighter colours. Each colour you get lighter, just adding a little scrapes and scratches and just some texture, especially around the strap on his gun. Okay, now we're moving on to Yarrick's noggin. We're going to paint his face, and I'm going to base coat it in Cadian Fleshtone, then do layering of Kislev Flesh and Flayed Flesh. After I've done the base coat of Cadian Fleshtone, I then do a wash of heavily watered down AK Wine Red. You could skip that stage and just use Reichland Flesh Shade if you want to, but I find that the AK Wine Red gives a nice, it does a dark wash and it adds some extra colour hints to his flesh tones, a little bit of redness, a little bit of pinkness to the flesh tones, and then it's just simple layering, picking out any, like his chin, his nose, bits around his eyes with the lighter colours. So the Kislev Flesh is a nice bright colour with the flesh tones. Painting faces I find can be quite tricky because the detail is really fine, but if you do struggle, Cadian Fleshtone, then use some Reichland Flesh Shade. Pick out some of the raised areas, the cheek, the nose, the mouth, the chin, with that Cadian Fleshtone again, and then just do smaller highlights with some Kislev Flesh and maybe some Flayed Flesh or Palette Witch Flesh. It depends how bright you want to go, but I find that the Kislev Flesh then to Flayed Flesh from a Cadian Fleshtone base is pretty good. It doesn't go too bright. As I said, you don't have to do the wine red part. If you wanted to, you could use watered down Carroburg Crimson instead of watered down wine red, or just use flat Reichland Flesh Shade. I pick out his teeth with just some pure white, and his tongue with some of the reds that we've used, with a little bit of that brown rose pink mixed in with it, just to give the tongue a little bit of a pinkish hint. And that's Yarrick pretty much finished. We're now just going to move on to the base. With the base, I did some heavy dry brushing of some like round tones like medium rusts from AK and then some light earth from AK. Then I covered the whole thing in the rust effect paint from Dirty Down and just let that dry. I then painted the flame in pure white. And now with the airbrush using some Vallejo white ink, I'm just spraying the bottom parts so there's some afterglow of the fire. The reflections from the fire are on the ground. And I'm just making sure that I aim the nozzle towards the flame so that the overspray is on just that front part there. I don't want the overspray going over too much of the base because although some of those areas would be in shadow. So if you just project where you think the light's going to be and hit those areas, don't go too far. As we said, we want it to be nice and bright in a particular spot and quite dark in others. So the first colour we're going to use once that's dry is some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Yellow Orange or Fluorescent Orange Yellow. It's pre-mixed by them and it's just a nice middle ground to save us having to do a yellow fluorescent and then an orange over the top, and it gives a nice fiery type finish, the orange yellow mix that they've done. So put a couple of drops of that into your airbrush, a little bit of water, not too much, and then a few sprays over all of the white, all of the flame, and just maybe a little bit over the surrounding area just so it blends in with the rest of the base. See where you've got a daylight lamp looking down onto this, the fluorescents are really bright, so it sort of almost whites out the effects. So I do turn the lamps off to try and show you what it looks like. Okay, once that's dry, it takes a few coats just to cover it. I always try and do short, sharp bursts with the airbrush, just so it doesn't overspray too much, it doesn't coat it too deeply, because it can get quite runny. And it takes about 5 minutes to dry once it's all coated. I'm then going to use some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red to now give that fiery, intense glow that you get. So what I'm doing here is I'm aiming downwards so that the bright orange is still really at the base of the fire, and then it gets darker towards the top. And I'm also trying to cover some of that overspray that we had, where we had the white going around on the base itself, where the glow from the fire would be, just so that that's showing that the heat is further away, the reflections of the heat is further away. So yeah, just aiming downwards, making sure that you cover the top parts so that the top parts of the fire go that nice fluorescent red. And what you'll notice here is even though you're darkening it down with a darker fluorescent red, you're actually making it seem like it's glowing more and more intense with some nice heat to it. It feels like it's actually got heat to it when we're adding this red. And then what I do once I've added enough of this fluorescent red, I then just directly into the fluorescent red, I add some Vallejo ink red, a few drops of that. And then what this will do is this will tone down some of the fluorescent red and just create some pure red. And that will be only on the tips of the fire where it's getting darker, where it's getting colder. And then I add some drops of Tenebrous Grey from AK into it as well, mix that together and then spray that over on the very tips where it is extremely cold and smoky, and then a few sprays downwards so that it catches some of those edges that are sticking out to show that the smoke is getting dark and cold. So when we're doing these glowing effects, generally speaking, the brighter, the hotter, the darker, the colder. And those are the colours that we've gone for. So fluorescent orangey yellow for the bright points, down into red as it's getting cooler, to tenebrous grey where it's gone into smoke and is much colder. So a few simple steps using the airbrush gives you a really nice glowing effect very quickly, very easily. You can do this via brushwork. You just need to be very careful in layering up the paint. I prefer to do it with the airbrush on these larger ones, as you get a slightly better effect. But if you are using a brush, you sort of have to apply the fluorescent paints in a number of layers to make it work and get the similar sort of effects. You can do it in just normal layering acrylic paints, yellows and oranges and reds, but it does take some time. I know people are quite dubious with an airbrush. It can be quite expensive, but I tend not to use expensive airbrushes. I've got a compressor that cost me £50 from eBay, and my airbrush is a £30 Fengda airbrush that I got off Amazon. It comes with a 0.03 or 0.04 needle. It works fantastically to base coat. It works fantastically to do these details and smaller details. I don't really have any problems with it. So the next step we're going to do once we've done that Tenebrous Grey is we want to apply some glowing effects, some OSL, object source lighting, to Yarrick himself. So what I did there, I just positioned the model on just to get an idea of where the fire would be reflecting off of his clothes and himself. I'm using Warhammer Air Evil Sun Scarlet for this through the airbrush, and what I'm doing is I'm pointing the nozzle towards the areas that would be reflecting that flame back. So a lot on his legs down at the bottom, on the front bit of his coat, a little bit on the gun, and just a little bit further up. Not too much. Less is more when it comes to these effects. If you do too much, like again, it's always going to have a highlight and it's not going to have any dark points. So just a few sprays of this on those areas where you want it to be reflecting back that light, making it, putting that model on the base to see how it would work is a great step. It means that you get some more realistic reflections of where the fire effects are going to be. Once I've done that, I've now attached Yarrick onto the base, and we're now just going to intensify some of those glowing effects, and we're just going to use a number of colours to do this. First of all, what I'm going to do with some of the Ionic Red that was still on the wet palette, but you could just use Evil Sun Scarlet if you've got some. I'm edge highlighting now where I want it to be really, really bright, and metallics will reflect light more than a sort of matte finished coat. So where those metallics are on the legs and on the trim, on the gun barrels, I do edge highlighting of this Ionic Red just to make those stand out a little bit more. We then go through a few stages now across the model to get some glowing effects. So once I've done the edge highlighting of where I want those bright points to be, I then use some pure white from AK, the AK Intense White, for some small highlights, edge highlights around the barrels of the gun, the gold trim on his coat and the metal bits on his legs. I then go over the top of those with some fluorescent orange from AK, another edge highlight. Then what that does, it shows that those areas are bouncing the light back from the flame more intensely than the other areas, and it helps sell the glowing from the fire onto his clothes. The other effects that I do on his lens and on his backpack are done very simply with base coating AK Wine Red, then using some AK Blood Red, or you can use that Ionic Red, or you can use Evil Sun Scarlet to fill it to go into the middle part of the wine red, then a little bit of fluorescent red and a little bit of fluorescent orange to get the glowing effects. Those sorts of effects are covered off in a majority of my tutorials, and they're very simple. That the AK Wine Red acts as the cold, then the Blood Red acts as the sort of part where it's starting to glow from, and then the white dot or the fluorescent colours act as where it's at its most brightest. And it's a little bit like we did the flame effect, but we're starting from the cold colour up to the really, really warm colour, and the more you add, the more brighter you get, the less paint you add. Most of my tutorials cover this in varying degrees. On Yarrick, there's not too much after we've done this airbrushing. So you can see here is where I'm adding those white points, where I'm going to go over it again in the AK fluorescent orange, and then a tiny bit of fluorescent yellow as well I use, just to really make it pop, to make it look like the gold trim is shining those colours back. So very simple steps, only a handful of colours used to get some really good effects. And once he's finished, I use some Army Painter's matte black to paint the base, and there he is. So we've got a non-metallic silver and gold Commissar Yarrick with a really cool flame effect on the front of his base. It'll seamlessly blend into your army there. We've not done any different colours, it's mostly done on the box art. The red really stands out, even though we've got some red glowing effects as well. That red that's on his actual claw does really stand out. His face stands out really well, and the non-metallic golds and silvers look really good, almost cartoony in a way, but it will definitely stand out on the battlefield. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As always, like, comment and subscribe. Your feedback is always really welcome. If you've got any models that you'd like me to give a go, just send me a message and I'll see if I can do a tutorial for you or give you some hints and tips. So yeah, happy painting, my fellow painters.